Do you think castles were warm? Huge stone halls, drafty and with walls that froze through, turned the lives of even the most noble lords into a daily struggle for survival. Comfort, as we understand it today, was simply unknown. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how people managed not to freeze in these stone giants, using technologies that will seem both primitive and ingenious to you. The enormous thickness of the castle's massive stone walls, often reaching several meters, up to 5 meters at the base of the towers, served not at all to effectively preserve precious heat inside the rooms, as one might think, but exclusively for reliable protection against destructive siege weapons, catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams. Natural stone, due to its physical properties, is a terrible, extremely ineffective heat insulator. It very quickly accumulates the surrounding cold from the air and then slowly but steadily releases it into the rooms throughout the winter. As a result of this process, during harsh winters, the thick walls of a medieval castle effectively became huge ice panels, radiating cold, constantly cooling the air inside. The thicker the wall was for protection, the worse it worked as an insulator, creating a paradoxical situation where military necessity contradicted domestic comfort. The castle's few windows, which we now often romantically refer to as loopholes or embrasures, were deliberately narrow vertical slits, specifically designed for shooting arrows or crossbows at besiegers. They let in a minimum of daylight and a maximum of piercing drafts and cold air from outside, making the rooms dark and drafty. Expensive glass in the early Middle Ages, until the 13th to 14th centuries, was a rarity, available only to the very wealthy, and cost a fortune. So windows in most castles were often simply covered with oiled rags or parchment for translucency, or thick wooden shutters that completely blocked out the light. Glass was so expensive that it was sometimes removed and taken away when moving to another castle as valuable property. The internal layout of the castle also strictly followed the military logic of defense and war, rather than the domestic comfort of its inhabitants. The living quarters of the owner and his family were often deliberately located on the upper floors of the towers, away from the damp, cold ground and for safety in case of a breach in the defenses. But this did not save them from the piercing wind that blew at height. The staircases inside the towers were spiral, narrow, and steep to make attacks from below more difficult, but they created constant, powerful drafts that swept through the entire building from bottom to top like a chimney, sucking out the heat. These vertical air currents made it impossible to retain heat on any floor, as warm air immediately rose up the stairwells. The rooms of the castle themselves were deliberately huge in area and volume, especially the main hall for feasts and gatherings, where most of the social life of the inhabitants took place. It was practically impossible to effectively heat such a gigantic space with a very high vaulted ceiling of 10 to 15 meters, even with several fireplaces. The meager heat from the few fireplaces instantly escaped upward under the arches according to the laws of physics, leaving the people below, at floor level, in an icy, untouched atmosphere of cold. A paradoxical situation arose. It was hot under the ceiling due to the accumulation of warm air, but at human height, it was freezing cold, from which it was impossible to escape. Even the private quarters of the lord and his family, considered a privilege, were very far from the modern concept of coziness and comfort. Often, they were simply parts of a large common hall, hastily partitioned off with heavy tapestries, without solid walls or small, cramped rooms measuring a few square meters, directly adjacent to the cold outer wall of the fortress. The medieval engineers and architects of the time were true geniuses of fortification and defensive structures, creating impregnable fortresses, but complex issues of heating, insulation, and comfort were of little concern to them, if any. The main priority was to build the most impregnable fortress possible, capable of withstanding a long siege lasting many months by superior enemy forces and protecting the garrison. The whole complex system of survival in the castle in winter was based not on attempts to heat the entire huge building, which was unrealistic, but on the selective heating of the person themselves through clothing, furs, and proximity to local heat sources. The philosophy was simple: don't heat the air, warm the body. This is the only realistic way to survive in a stone refrigerator.
Very cold.
A tapestry, or wall hanging, was a thick, lint-free carpet woven by hand from wool and silk threads. Wool is known to be an excellent heat insulator. These massive canvases were hung on special hooks along cold stone walls. The secret of their effectiveness lay in the creation of an air gap. A layer of still air remained between the cold stone wall and the tapestry. This air, heated by people's breath and the warmth of the hearth, served as a barrier that prevented the cold from the wall from penetrating into the room. In addition, tapestries effectively combated drafts. They were hung not only on walls but also above doorways and windows, creating dense curtains. They prevented cold air from circulating freely through the rooms, making the space more enclosed and cozy. Of course, tapestries were a luxury item. The cost of one such canvas could be comparable to the cost of a small estate. Only the wealthiest feudal lords could afford them, which emphasized their status and wealth. The process of creating a tapestry was incredibly laborious. Several craftsmen could work on one large tapestry for several years. The subjects for tapestries were varied: biblical scenes, knightly exploits, hunting motifs. In addition to warmth, tapestries brought color and life to the gloomy stone halls. They also significantly improved the acoustics in huge echoing rooms by absorbing the echo. It was a multifunctional device that combined practicality, art, and a demonstration of power. For the less wealthy inhabitants of the castle, there were simpler alternatives. Walls could be hung with cheaper fabrics, skins, or even just thick straw mats. The principle remained the same: creating an insulating air gap. The basis of everything was the first layer, which was close to the body. It was made of linen, not wool. Linen absorbed sweat and moisture well, drawing it away from the body, which allowed the skin to remain dry and avoid hypothermia. Several layers of woolen clothing were worn over the linen shirt. Wool has a unique property: it continues to warm even when wet. It was the combination of moisture-wicking linen and warming wool that was the key to comfort. Outerwear or surcoats were often lined with fur. Fur was the most effective insulator of the time. Not only did it retain heat well, but it also served as an indicator of the owner's high status. The legs were also well protected. Men wore narrow stockings called chausses, which were made of woolen fabric. Particular attention was paid to protecting the head, neck, and hands. Hoods were an integral part of outerwear. They tightly covered the head and neck, and sometimes had a long tail that could be wrapped around the face in severe frost. Gloves and mittens were made of leather and lined with fur. They were necessary not only outdoors, but also indoors in cold rooms. Holding a metal cup or book in an unheated room was a real challenge. Shoes were made of thick leather, and felt or straw insoles were placed inside for extra warmth. In particularly cold weather, several pairs of woolen socks could be worn. Every detail of the wardrobe was designed with survival in mind. Imagine a large, carefully laid out fireproof stone area, several meters in diameter, right in the middle of a spacious hall at floor level. A huge, roaring fire of thick logs was maintained there around the clock, day and night, and never went out completely. Good quality firewood for such a voracious hearth was required in truly colossal quantities. several cartloads a day, and its constant harvesting, cutting, and delivery was one of the most important and labor-intensive tasks for the numerous servants and inhabitants of the castle. Without a constant supply of dry firewood, life in the castle would come to a standstill, as the hearth was not only a source of heat, but also a means of cooking food for hundreds of people. The acrid smoke from the constantly burning fire naturally rose upwards, according to the laws of physics, to the high vaulted ceilings of the hall, creating a veil. A special wide opening, called a lucarne or smoke vent, was made in the roof directly above the hearth, sometimes with a wooden cover to protect it from the rain. Through it, a large but not all of the smoke slowly escaped to the fresh air, although, of course, not all of it, and not always effectively, especially when the wind was unfavorable. The effectiveness of such ventilation depended heavily on the direction of the wind outside. When the wind was blowing in the opposite direction, the smoke could not escape at all and remain in the room, making the air unbreathable. This is why the high ceilings and upper parts of stone walls in medieval halls were always covered with a thick, greasy layer of black soot and soot that had eaten into the stone. The air in the room was constantly filled with smoke of varying concentrations around the clock, which was one of the main causes of frequent chronic respiratory diseases, coughs, and lung problems among the inhabitants. The closer a person sat or stood to the hot fire, the higher their social status and position in the feudal hierarchy of the castle. The lord and his family occupied places directly by the fire, in places of honor, while the commoners huddled on the periphery in the cold, content with the remnants of heat. It was only in the late Middle Ages, around the 13th and 14th centuries, that the first wall-mounted fireplaces with vertical chimneys built into the thickness of the wall gradually appeared, revolutionizing living conditions and comfort. They made it possible to heat individual small rooms much more efficiently and completely get rid of acrid smoke in the room by venting it outside through a pipe. But even the thickest, most massive castle walls, several meters thick, and a large blazing fire in the center of the hall could not completely protect the inhabitants from the pervasive cold in winter. In the next chapter, we will talk in detail about how inventive people created localized areas of warmth and comfort in their private quarters and bedrooms using various tricks. If the main hall was heated by a large stationary hearth, how was the heat maintained in the lord's private chambers, where it was impossible to build a fire on the floor? For this purpose, there were special portable devices, braziers. They were medieval analogs of modern portable heaters. A brazier was a metal or ceramic bowl on legs. Hot coals from the main hearth were placed inside this bowl. The brazier radiated gentle heat, capable of warming a small enclosed space, such as a bedroom or study. The use of braziers required great care. Open coals posed a serious fire hazard. Therefore, braziers were usually placed in the center of the room, away from wooden furniture, beds, and tapestries. The main fuel for braziers was charcoal, not ordinary firewood. Charcoal burned with virtually no smoke or flame, while giving off a lot of heat. This was critically important for use in enclosed spaces without special ventilation. However, the smokeless combustion of coal posed another invisible danger: carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide poisoning was not uncommon in medieval castles. Therefore, rooms where braziers were used had to be ventilated periodically, despite the cold. Braziers were not only functional objects but also works of art. They were made of bronze or iron and decorated with embossing and intricate ornaments. A rich brazier, like a tapestry, was an indicator of its owner's status. They were used not only to heat rooms. Small braziers were placed under the table during meals to warm the feet. There were even special small braziers for warming the hands, which noble ladies carried with them. The process of maintaining braziers was continuous. Servants had to constantly bring new portions of hot coals from the main hearth and remove the cooled ashes. Keeping the master's chambers warm was one of their many duties. Braziers were a compromise solution that allowed for the creation of an island of warmth in the icy ocean of the castle. They were inefficient and dangerous, but in the absence of other technologies, they at least provided the illusion of comfort. It was a local rather than a global heating system. Thus, the castle's heating was multi-level. The huge hearth in the main hall served as the main source of heat, and braziers carried this heat to individual rooms. But even this was not enough to fully protect against the cold. In the Middle Ages, heat was obtained not only from outside but also from within. The diet of castle dwellers was directly linked to the need to survive in the cold. High-calorie, fatty, and hot food was not a whim, but a necessity, fuel for the inner fire. The diet consisted mainly of thick soups and stews, which were cooked in huge cauldrons over an open fire. They were made from meat, beans, root vegetables, and grains. Such food retained heat for a long time and provided the body with a lot of energy for self-heating. Meat was an important part of the diet, especially in winter. Fatty meats such as pork and lamb were particularly highly valued. Fat is a concentrated source of energy that was necessary to maintain body temperature. Bread was also an integral part of the meal. It was dense and filling, eaten with butter, lard, or simply dipped in hot soup. It was a simple and affordable source of carbohydrates that provided quick energy. Spices played an important role. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper were all considered hot and warming. They were generously added not only to food but also to drinks. The most popular warming drink was heated ale or wine. Honey and spices were added to them, creating a kind of medieval mulled wine. Hot alcoholic beverages created a quick, albeit short-lived, feeling of warmth and lifted the spirits. Breakfast was usually hearty and hot. It could be porridge with milk or ale, leftovers from yesterday's stew, or just bread with lard. Getting a hot meal in the morning was important to get the internal stove going for the whole day. The process of eating itself was a warming ritual. All the inhabitants of the castle gathered in the main hall by the hearth. Hot food, warmth from the fire, and the closeness of other people all helped to combat the cold. Thus, the medieval diet was ideally suited to the harsh conditions. It was aimed at maximizing energy intake, which was spent not on physical work, but on simply sustaining life in an icy stone world. Food was as much a part of the heating system as firewood or coal. All the methods we have discussed were merely ways of adapting to the cold, not defeating it. They allowed local areas of warmth to be created, but could not heat the entire castle. The real revolution in everyday life came with the invention and spread of the wall-mounted fireplace with a chimney. This technology, which appeared in the high and late Middle Ages, changed everything. The idea was simple. Move the hearth from the center of the hall to the wall and enclose it in a stone firebox. And instead of venting the smoke through a hole in the roof, it was vented through a special vertical channel inside the wall, a chimney. The advantages were enormous. First, it completely solved the problem of smoke in the rooms. The air in the halls became clean and breathable, and the walls and ceilings were no longer covered with soot. Secondly, the fireplace was much more efficient than an open hearth. It radiated heat in a targeted manner, deep into the room, rather than in all directions. This allowed the room to be heated more efficiently while using less wood. The advent of fireplaces changed the very architecture and social structure of the castle. Now it was possible to effectively heat not only one huge hall, but many small rooms. This gave impetus to the development of the concept of privacy. The lord and his family were able to move from the common hall to their own warm and cozy quarters. The castle ceased to be just a collective refuge and began to turn into a home with private spaces. This was the beginning of the end of classical medieval life. Fireplaces began to be installed not only in the Lord's chambers, but also in guest rooms, libraries, and studies. The opportunity to be warm and secluded contributed to the development of culture, reading, and science. Comfort ceased to be an unattainable luxury. The construction of fireplaces and chimneys was a complex and expensive undertaking, requiring highly skilled masons. Having several fireplaces in a castle became a new symbol of status and wealth. They were decorated with carvings, coats of arms, and sculptures. With the spread of fireplaces, many old methods gradually became a thing of the past. Braziers became less necessary, and tapestries began to serve mainly a decorative function. The canopy bed, however, remained popular for a long time, as it provided an unmatched level of comfort. It was the chimney that drew the line between medieval survival and the comforts of the new era. This simple but ingenious invention finally allowed people to tame the cold inside their homes. The icy stone prison gradually began to transform into a warm and cozy home. These methods show us how resourceful and adaptable humans can be. In the absence of the technologies we are accustomed to, people created their own, based on a deep understanding of materials and the laws of nature. It was a whole science of survival, honed over centuries. The history of heating castles is a story of a gradual shift from collective survival around a common hearth to individual comfort in private quarters, made possible by the chimney revolution. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new explorations of the mysteries of the past.